So it looks like we can expect at least 3 more solo Spider-Man films featuring the current MCU version of Peter Parker, which is awesome, as I am personally really digging Tom Holland's version of the character. So what comic storylines could we see the filmmakers pull from for this next trilogy? Well, I went ahead and pulled together a small handful that I would like to see, and in this video, I'm gonna break them down for you. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and dive right into it. Let's start this video off with not necessarily some storylines that I'd like to see, but more or less specific things that I think would be cool to see in those larger, overarching stories. Since the next Spider-Man trilogy is heavily rumored to be taking Peter Parker out of high school and into college, there are a few friends that he made during his time at Empire State University in the comics that could wind up popping up on the big screen. First is good old Flash Thompson. Now, as of the recording of this video, we don't really know where No Way Home is going to leave Flash. But if he makes his way through that movie and winds up going to ESU along with Parker, I'd like to see their relationship evolve as it did on the page. See, Flash has always been presented as a bully during his time in high school, and that has been no different in the Tom Holland movies. However, in the comics, once he moved on to college, he did quite a bit of growing up, and actually wound up being fairly good friends with Parker. So if this new trilogy is indeed taking things to university, it could be a good place to evolve this version of Flash. And Flash isn't the only friend that he made during his time at college. At one point in the comics, Parker was paired up with a roommate when he was living in the dorms. This roommate was a British exchange student named Brian Braddock, who, on the surface, appeared to be your typical stuffy English rich boy. However, fans will know that that is not at all the case, as Braddock is actually the superhero Captain Britain. With rumors having been floating around for a while now that Captain Britain will be springing up in the MCU somewhere, this could be a super solid place to put him. Of course, there is another young superhero that they could introduce here instead, that being Johnny Storm, aka the Human Torch, member of the Fantastic Four. In the comics, Storm was a student at ESU very briefly at the same time as Parker, and during this time, the two became good friends, independent of their time spent as heroes. With the Fantastic Four film being slated to hit theaters in the future though, this might be a situation where we as an audience already know who Storm is, but Parker might not. So maybe not a proper introduction necessarily, but a meeting between these two heroes, who are often depicted as being pretty good friends on the page. There was another character that Parker met during his time in college that would wind up being a major part of the character's history that we haven't really gotten much of a representation of on the big screen, outside of a small cameo that is. That being Felicia Hardy, aka the Black Cat. And yes, I know that he met her during grad school, not regular college, but you know what? It's close enough. Hardy was the daughter of a famed cat burglar, Walter Hardy, who had spent most of her life in prison for his crimes. However, after training under her father's mentor, the Black Fox, Hardy donned the Black Cat costume to try to break her father out of prison. That same night, she wound up meeting Spider-Man, and although she was set on leading a life of crime, she felt a sort of odd kinship with the webhead, and over the course of the years that followed, their relationship transformed from an antagonistic one to a romantic one, back to an antagonistic one, over and over and over again, until Black Cat eventually transformed into more of an anti-hero than a straight-up villain. Now, the current batch of Spider-Man films has given us the relationship between Peter and MJ, which seems to be pretty solid, all things considered, and I don't see that going away anytime soon. However, establishing a secondary love interest could be a smart move if the actress ever decided to move on, or the studio chose to write her out for whatever reason. It's not like Spider-Man's girlfriends have really historically had that great of a life expectancy. This seems to be what Sony might have originally been intending to do with the Amazing Spider-Man films, as they had Felicity Jones cameo as Hardy in the second movie, presumably to set up a larger appearance in the third film that we never got. So maybe they'll try it again, you never know. Plus, I mean, Sony did once talk about doing a Black Cat Silver Sable movie, so maybe there's something there. Of course, if they were to ever actually write out MJ for whatever reason, they might as well do it in the most dramatic way possible. And what Spider-Man girlfriend has had a more dramatic end than Gwen Stacy? The Night That Gwen Stacy Died is a comic arc that we have gotten at least one adaptation of, and one sort of semi-allusion to, and there's a good reason why it keeps coming up. This event, which saw the death of one of Spider-Man's most beloved side characters, did a lot when it first came out. Character-wise, it marked the first time Peter Parker had truly failed, at least in any major way that really mattered. And the MCU Spider-Man hasn't really had a moment like that yet. Sure, he's had some bad moments where he has screwed up or something has happened that made things look super bleak, but they've always wound up working out for him in the end. Even the Thanos situation ultimately went his way. Now sure, Mysterio seemed to get the last laugh, putting Parker in a super tough spot. But if I had to venture a guess, that'll work out for him as well. So having a storyline where, even if he stops the villain, he still has to deal with some permanent consequences could go a long way towards helping further his character growth. And swapping MJ in for the as of yet introduced MCU Gwen Stacy would allow them to start bringing in some of those other Spider-Man love interests. That is, of course, if the studio is at all interested in doing something like that. Now, if they really wanted to destroy Peter's friend group completely in order to build a new one for whatever reason, they could also take out Ned in a very dramatic and intense way by bringing in the Hobgoblin. In the comics, Ned Leeds' connection to the Hobgoblin started when he was sent on assignment by J. Jonah Jameson to investigate the Hobgoblin's activities. While following him one night, he was captured and brainwashed into actually thinking that he was the Hobgoblin, leading him into doing some of the villain's dirty work. Ned did find out that he wasn't the Hobgoblin, but the guy who actually was released info that implicated Leeds, leading to someone taking him out in retaliation for stuff that Hobgoblin did. Could something like this be in the future for the MCU Ned? It would allow this version to get a bit closer to the comic version, with whom he hasn't really had too much in common, outside of a relationship with Betty Brant. But how likely is it really? Honestly, at this point with the MCU, nothing would really surprise me, unless it's something that they've already kinda done. They aren't really going to be repeating themselves. Probably. Although, if they go with this particular story arc, they would be repeating something, I suppose. Repeating Peter Parker's. Alright, that was a pretty bad segue, but we're moving on. The Clone Saga started off about 20 or so years before the start of the actual Clone Saga arc in the comics. Back in Amazing Spider-Man number 148, we found out that the villainous Jackal was a clone of Peter Parker, and that there was another perfect clone waiting in the wings. While by the end of the story we were led to believe that both clones were destroyed, the perfect one actually survived and took on the name Ben Reilly. Of course, we didn't find that out until the 90s, when even more clones came to light and started causing trouble for Peter Parker. Giving us some variation of the Clone Saga could very well provide an answer for something that we all know is more than likely on the horizon. While Sony and Disney are playing nice with the webhead at the moment, that doesn't mean they are always going to be. So the day might come when Sony wants to take Spider-Man for themselves. If that happened, introducing Ben Reilly could allow for the Scarlet Spider to exist still within the MCU, allowing him to effectively take the place of the normal wall crawler in any plans that Disney and Marvel might have for the character. Of all the possible solutions to this problem that they could go with, I don't really see this being the one that they choose, but hey, you never know. This is a story arc that is almost so perfectly set up for a college-era Peter Parker story that it would be a shame to not see it happen. Spider-Man No Way Home is giving us the first appearance of the Lizard within the MCU, though this is specifically the Amazing Spider-Man version of the monstrous villain. So there is nothing to say that we couldn't get an MCU adaptation of the Shed story arc. This storyline showed us a far more tragic take on Dr. Kurt Connors than we have ever seen. Instead of being presented as a crazed beast out for blood, we got to see who he was on the inside, a broken man transformed into a hideous and terrifying monster. Tonally, it might not necessarily fit in with the more humorous MCU, but getting a chance to see this more dark version of the villain could be fantastic. And remember how I said that it would fit a college-era Peter Parker? Just make Connors one of Peter's professors. I mean, we already saw that in the Raimi movies, so just do that here. And boom, absolutely perfect fit. This one is certainly one of the more bizarre entries on this list, but it's just such a fun idea that I couldn't not include it. Spider Island answered a question that I'm sure at least one of you out there asked yourselves at some point in the past. What if everyone around me suddenly developed superpowers? In this case, the inhabitants of Manhattan all mysteriously started developing the same spider-based powers as Peter Parker. Naturally, as you would expect, chaos ensued, as some started to use these powers for their own nefarious means. To deal with the total anarchy, Spider-Man worked alongside several other heroes to try to figure out a solution and revert all of the citizens back to their normal selves. Oh yeah, and while all this was going on, the heroes discovered that if left unfixed, this situation would only get worse, as people started to mutate into larger, spider-esque monstrosities. So, you know, not great. But how well would this work as a movie? Honestly, it could be a ton of fun, and could give us another character-focused pseudo-Avengers film, kind of like Captain America Civil War, by having a ton of other heroes pop up in order to help Parker handle all of the craziness. And it could be a great time for us to finally hear the old "with great power comes great responsibility" line that we have yet to hear in the MCU. Perhaps Peter could say it to MJ as she started dealing with her own spider powers, like her comic counterpart did. For a while there, before we had any idea what No Way Home was gonna wind up being, a lot of us in the YouTube theorizing space were throwing around a ton of different possible comic arcs that could be adapted. One that kept coming up over and over and over is one that is probably one of the best Spider-Man related stories of all time: Kraven's Last Hunt. Kraven is a man who believes himself superior to all others. To prove this point, he once seemingly hunted down and killed Spider-Man. After burying the webhead, he donned a copy of Spider-Man's suit and set out on the town. During his time posing as the wall crawler, he brutally beat down several criminals and successfully managed to capture a villain called Vermin, whom Spider-Man had previously required the aid of Captain America to take down. A little while later, Peter Parker, who had actually been tranquilized and not killed, woke up and dug himself out of the grave Kraven had put him in. Upon confronting Kraven for the kinda messed up situation he put him in, the Hunter did nothing to stand against Parker, as he felt he had proven himself to be superior to him in every way. After Spider-Man left to track down Vermin, whom Kraven had just released, the Hunter wrote a note confessing what he had done to Spider-Man, including photographic evidence, and then took his own life, feeling that there was really nothing left for him to do in the world. It's a dark storyline for sure, but if we were to see Kraven get brought to the big screen, there really is no better storyline involving the character that we would like to see adapted. It is for sure the pinnacle. Of course, after all the nonsense that Peter Parker has gone through, not just in his solo movies, but also in Civil War and the 2 Avengers movies, it would be completely understandable if the guy just wanted to hang up the red and blue tights and call it quits. This is basically what happened in the Spider-Man No More story arc in the comics, which saw Parker walking away from his life as Spider-Man due to the fact that, no matter how many people he saved, he would always be doubted and scrutinized by people such as J. Jonah Jameson and all of his ilk, giving us one of the most iconic comic covers of all time. Now, we have sort of already seen this arc adapted on the big screen once before. In Spider-Man 2, Peter started losing his powers, so he in turn dumped his suit and tried to get on with his life. However, if Sony ever wanted to drop Tom Holland, be it due to the end of his contract or what have you, they could always just ignore the end of the arc where he returns to being Spider-Man, and instead have someone else take up the mantle. It's certainly one route that they could go, or they could go in a completely different direction with it. What if the way that Sony went about moving on from Tom Holland's Peter Parker was to bring in all of his former villains and send them after him all at once? It sounds kind of like No Way Home to be sure, but I'm thinking more in line with what happened in the Ultimate Universe during the aptly named Death of Spider-Man story arc. This is actually the storyline that we saw get kind of adapted at the very beginning of Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. However, the comic version is, in my opinion, far more dramatic, with the climax of the story seeing Green Goblin and Spidey throwing down in the suburbs where Peter lived, culminating in Peter smashing Goblin with a truck and ultimately dying in Mary Jane's arms as all of his friends and neighbors looked on in shock. If Sony ever wanted to swap over to having Miles Morales be the main Spider-Man, this could be a good way to set up a passing of the torch, and would give a dramatic and powerful end to Tom Holland's already legendary run as the Webhead. Hey there everybody, I'm John Aljets. I made this video, and I want to know what you think. Which of these story arcs would you like to see adapted in the next Spider-Man trilogy? Let me know in the comments below, or go ahead and shoot me a response over on Twitter. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to CBR for more great videos in the future.